Today's presentation will cover racial and ethnic minority fathers of individuals with autism, considerations for care and support. Just to give you a little background information on the New Jersey Statewide Network for Cultural Competence. The New Jersey Statewide Network for Cultural Competence is a collaboration of both private and nonprofit agencies who have partnered to develop a broad-based network to advance culturally and linguistically appropriate service delivery practices in New Jersey. We were established in 2002 and currently have more than 130 public and nonprofit state, community, and private sector agencies engaged in promoting culturally and linguistically competent service delivery, education, policies, and practices. My name is Shelly Ann Dakers, and I'm a training and consultation specialist at the Bach Center on Developmental Disabilities, and will be the moderator for today's webinar. Before I begin, I'd like to address a few housekeeping items. Because of the number of participants on our call, your telephone lines will be muted throughout the call. However, using the webinar technology, you can submit questions at any point in time during the presentation via the chat or questions box on your webinar console to your right. You can send questions at any time during the presentation. I will compile your questions, which will be addressed at the end of the session. We'll also take a brief pause during the middle of the webinar to address any pending questions before we continue. Please know that we may not be able to pose every question to the presenter and may combine some of the questions, but you will have the opportunity we will send all of your questions to the presenter at the end of the webinar, even if he's unable to answer some of the questions towards the end. Additionally, this webinar will be recorded and archived on the NJSNCC website. Finally, a short survey will pop up on your screen immediately following the webinar. Your feedback is really important to us, and we appreciate you taking the time to fill out the short survey. Now, I'm honored to introduce to you our guest speaker for today, Michael Hannon. Dr. Hannon is an assistant professor of counseling in the Department of Counseling and Educational Leadership at Mount Clair State University in New Jersey. He has more than 10 years of experience counseling students in educational settings, urban, high school counseling, college counseling, and student affairs administration, and supporting parents of children with autism. He has a doctoral degree in counseling education and supervision from Penn State University. His research explores the intersection of fathers of individuals with autism and service providers. Specifically, Dr. Hannon is interested in how fathers, and especially fathers of color, describe how autism influences their identity and their experiences with schools and school counselors. His dissertation was the first empirical study to investigate the lived experiences of African American fathers of individuals with autism. Dr. Hannon has authored and co-authored over 30 academic presentations and publications on topics related to urban school counseling and the psychosocial aspects of childhood disabilities on family members. His research has been funded by the Association for Humanistic Counseling, Penn State University College of Education, and the City University of New York. Dr. Hannon and his wife, LaShawn, are the co-founders of the Greater Expectations Teaching and Advocacy Center for Childhood Disabilities, a nonprofit organization based in Burleson County, New Jersey, dedicated to supporting families raising children with developmental differences. This organization focuses on 3 primary areas of service: parent education and advocacy, counseling services for family members of children with developmental differences, and professional development for teachers of children with autism. And without further ado, I present to you Dr. Hannon.
Thank you, Shelley, and to the New Jersey Statewide Network on Cultural Competence. I really appreciate the opportunity to engage with you and all of the guests today who found it worthwhile to connect with us by way of this webinar. I want to extend a special thanks to Dr. Robert Like, and again, the broader network, those service providers, and the leadership teams and committees that exist within the network, which we affectionately call ourselves, and specifically Nancy, Zenaida, and Shelley, who have really been awesome and helpful and making sure that I have all I need to hopefully give you something worthwhile today. And so I appreciate, again, your carving out some time to spend with me today and with us today as we think about how autism affects families and specifically fathers of color. And I'll be sharing with you both my research, findings from my research and things that I've discovered, but also I'll be sharing with you my own experiential knowledge, just as I know all of you have experiential knowledge based on your experiences and what you know based on those experiences. I happen to be the father of two awesome children, one of whom has a form of autism, and I do identify as Black. And all of these intersecting identities and roles, I believe, influence the experiences of fathers, and specifically fathers of color, who have children or individuals with autism. And so as we think about how we will spend our time today, hopefully you can see the slides clearly, but our objectives for today are fairly simple, even though these conversations can become complex based on the roles in which you have in your professional and personal lives. But first, hopefully the presentation will allow all of us to deepen our understanding about autism's psychosocial influence on families and fathers. Secondly, to really increase our knowledge about what racial ethnic minority fathers of individuals with autism describe as rewards and challenges in that experience and that identity. And then thirdly, to discuss, and I'll share with you what I believe I'm finding by way of some of the research I'm doing, is how to better engage and support minority fathers of individuals with autism if and when they decide to engage in help-seeking behavior. So I think it's important to kind of frame our conversation with respect to my own professional identity. I'm a counselor by profession. I served as a school counselor for several years in an urban district, and I've done some group and community-based work supporting individuals' mental health affected by autism. And in that perspective, as a mental health professional, my orientation is very clear, and I want to just make sure I say four things that highlight those distinctions. As a counselor, I have a wellness orientation, and that is wanting to support consumers, clients who seek help, and making sure they can identify their strengths and assets versus being focused primarily on diagnosing problem areas. And so my wellness orientation certainly influences my lens. The second thing I want to say about my orientation as a counselor is that counselors are focused on prevention and early intervention. So doing what it is we can as a community of counselors to make sure we're helping individuals, families, communities prevent things that may happen to them, prevent experiences so that their mental health and well-being is promoted and sustained over time. Thirdly, we work from a developmental perspective, and that is acknowledging that many of the challenges that all of us face in our day-to-day experiences, we believe are developmental in nature. And if we can anticipate some of those challenges, it makes it easier to engage in those preventative and early intervention efforts in helping clients, communities, families, and individuals. And then lastly, counselors really support, as many other mental health professionals and clinicians, they want to perpetuate and support client empowerment. So helping clients, consumers find their strengths and their assets so that they are not dependent on a relationship with a counselor, but are able to essentially flex their muscles in their community, in their settings, in their work settings, in their home settings, even when they have challenges that beset them. So hopefully that gives you some context about my own professional orientation. One question I field all the time is, why is this conversation important? And it's a legitimate question because there are some folks who constructively critique some of my work and say, you know what, Mike, we don't need to be thinking about solely people of color or racial ethnic minorities as compared to other populations in this country, in our home communities in New Jersey, and across the nation. And I respectfully disagree with that, and by way of acknowledging that diagnoses and developmental differences affect communities differently. And we can do that we can acknowledge that at a micro level. My family experiences this differently than your family, and even if both of our families happen to be Black. But my community may experience something different from your community when it comes to how we make sense of diagnoses when it comes to our developmental and mental health. And so when we think about autism, or autism spectrum disorder, as the DSM-5 identifies it, when we think about the trends, it is the most frequently diagnosed condition among children in this country right now. If you look at just the last point on this slide, it acknowledges that autism is more prevalent in pediatric populations than cancer, diabetes, and Down syndrome combined. And so when we think about the trends, we have to acknowledge that this is important and requires our attention as service providers, as parents and caregivers, as individuals who work in schools, and all the places in which we find ourselves. This is affecting us, and it's likely affecting you, even if you don't have a direct relationship with autism. You may know this, but nationally, 1 in 68 children are diagnosed at this point in time, based on the Center for Disease Control and Prevention's most recent report last April, which is just about a year ago. And that's up from 1 in 88 from their report in 2012, and then up from 1 in 110 from their report in 2010. And nationally, males are diagnosed 6 times more frequently than females. And then to hopefully offer some context, in New Jersey, I believe it's arguable that we can say we have the most frequent diagnosis rate in the country. And even if that's not entirely true or entirely accurate, our rate is 1 in 45 in New Jersey. So if we think about classrooms, as a guy who spent time working in schools and communities, when you think about a classroom, if a classroom has up to 25 students in a good district, a good supportive district, consider that there's 1 student in every 2 classrooms with autism that's been diagnosed and identified. And for those of us who work in service provision, we know that even though there isn't a diagnosis, many times we can identify the needs and symptoms associated with a particular condition, even when it's not been identified, for a variety of reasons. And so the conversation is important because autism is affecting all of us in some way, shape, or form. It's probably important to describe what autism is and its symptomology. Autism is a neurological and developmental disorder and or difference depending on your orientation. It's typically considered an Axis 1 diagnosis in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Illnesses in the 5th edition. And most of the symptomology, most of what autism looks like, is individuals have challenges and or differences in the way they communicate. So socially expressive and receptive language, those skills, the skill development in that way is challenged. And you might find some hyper-focused interest. So my son in particular is a lover of video games, and it's hard to pull him away from video games. And that hyper-focused, highly repetitive behavior are 2 primary symptoms of autism spectrum disorder, in addition to the social and communication challenges that individuals with autism confront. And so hopefully that provides a context. I want to make sure I'm not assuming that everybody knows what autism is or what it looks like. So hopefully that's helpful. Extending our discourse about why this conversation is important. Here's what we know, just based on people's lived experiences in this country in particular. And some folks may even say globally, that the social distribution of disability is tied to the degree of social advantage when we think about certain demographic profiles. The one obviously we're talking about today is race or racial identity. But when we think about demographic profiles such as gender, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, gender expression, all of those tend to influence who is diagnosed and how they are diagnosed. And typically in this country, people of color are diagnosed with more severe and long-term diagnoses than what we find in our white counterparts. And it's something important to acknowledge. There's some evidence nationally that suggests that children of color have been found to be diagnosed with autism both later and differently than white children. And now this is an interesting point because the data are mixed. The evidence is mixed. because there's data that suggests that children of color are being diagnosed later and with different diagnoses or dually diagnosed. And then there's some evidence that suggests that those diagnoses trends are pretty much the same or equal and comparable, especially in New Jersey. In New Jersey, evidence suggests that children are generally diagnosed along the same trends, but in other spaces, and depending on who's doing the research and the questions being asked, you might find different results. But in the studies that I'm referencing here, 1 in 63 white children, 1 in 81 black children, and 1 in 93 Latino or Hispanic children are diagnosed nationally. And if you ask why that's important, it's because for those children of color, access to care may be an issue. If you combine the two variables of racial or ethnic identity and socioeconomic status, consider preventative medicine and preventative care, and the extent to which I can get to the doctor as a person of color who may be poor or don't have good, trusting relationships with my service providers, those diagnoses may come later. But I also want us to consider how service providers and clinicians, those of us in the service provision community, might perceive and experience children of color compared to white children. So children of color tend to be, some evidence suggests, dually diagnosed, typically with a conduct or behavioral disorder, either before or dually with autism diagnoses. And so that's something really important to consider as we think about how we engage with, experience, and the extent to which we are monitoring our own inherent biases when it comes to certain populations of consumers or clients. And so when we think about the importance of this conversation, hopefully that highlights some of the reasons why this conversation is important. When we think about fatherhood, I want us to think about some specific things. When we think about fatherhood and the transition to fatherhood for men, it means several things, and that's important for mental health clinicians as we work with people to help them make meaning of their experiences. What does it mean to be a father? Research tells us, and we know by way of our experiences and our relationships with fathers, that it's a cornerstone of adult development. And there's evidence that suggests that becoming a father for men yields positive and healthy behavioral choices. So things like changes in diet, less risky behavior, increased physical activity, less drug and alcohol use, have all been attributed to the experience of becoming a father. But the demands of fatherhood are complex because they can give us both extreme pride and extreme stress. And so I want us to kind of acknowledge the complexity in any caregiving or parenting role, the spectrum of experiences and interpretations we have as we navigate our new identity, right? Some of those stresses are related to finding a new place. Whether this is my first child or my fifth child, I still have to renegotiate. My whole family system has to renegotiate who I am and what I'm going to do and what my role is in the context of this new family member coming into my life. When we think about fatherhood roles, what we generally know, particularly in the United States, is that these roles have evolved over time, but typically include being a provider, and much more evidence recently acknowledging the importance of emotional provision in addition to financial provision, but protector as well, shared decision maker, child socializer, and a supporter of a parent or a spouse, the other partner or the spouse. And so thinking about some of those roles that we assume as fathers, and I'll acknowledge that many of these roles, one might argue, are gendered, right? We socialize our children to assume these roles based on their gender, but some of them are not as gendered, and we can hopefully take pride in the shared responsibility and the shared roles in the context of family to provide for our children and our entire family system. But I want us to think just as intentionally about, again, the meaning making of fatherhood. And hopefully it'll be clear, what will be clear is the intersection of the meaning that men make of becoming fathers and what it means to be a father of an individual with autism. So consider this. Decanter, who's a philosopher, talked about fathers constantly negotiating 3 levels of meaning, right? So I'm a new dad. I've got this new child in my family. Let's just say I am in a monogamous relationship with the mother, the biological mother of the child. But the person of the father, here's one level of meaning that I'm constantly negotiating and renegotiating. What is the person of the father? And what I mean when I say that is, what does my embodiment, my phenotype, what I look like, represent to other people? What does what I look like as a black man, as a person who has a doctoral degree, as a person who is a trash collector, whatever the roles I assume and what I look like to other people, what does that mean to them? And then their interpretation, what does it mean to me? And men are generally, fathers, it can be argued, are generally conscious of this consideration. And how does that make me feel about myself? The position of the father, again, we'll think about being gendered and socialized in this way, but position of the father really speaks to my capital, my social capital, my cultural capital, my financial capital. And because I've been socialized to be a provider in the context of my family, I'm assessing pretty consistently what kinds of resources that I have. Can I navigate between environments with success and ease? Or do I have anxiety when I have to go meet with the banker because I generally don't have to engage with bankers frequently because this is the first time I've bought a home? Or because I happen to be a member of a fraternity, my network is bigger and I can rely on networks, that social capital that exists. And so fathers are also considering that position, their resources and their capital, both financial and social and cultural. And then the last consideration is the symbol of the father, and that is not so much what I represent to other people, but what do I represent to my child? What symbol, what interpretations does my child have of me based on my interactions with him or her or them? And if we think about these 3 domains, about what it means to be a father, it becomes quite telling and informative when we consider what it means to be a father of an individual with autism who happens to be a member of a racial or ethnic minority. I want to consider a theoretical framework here as I'm looking at my time and thinking we're about halfway through before we pause and open up to a larger amount of questions. Many of you may be familiar with this, but Carter and McGoldrick are 2 awesome researchers here in New Jersey who came up with the family life cycle theory. And the family life cycle theory, I think, really does this experience some justice, does this phenomenon some justice when we think about how families and parents raising children with developmental difference and fathers raising individuals with autism, racial or ethnic minority fathers raising individuals with autism. So the family life cycle theory basically acknowledges the transitions that exist and take place over the course of a family's entire life cycle. And it acknowledges that there are both normative stressors that we experience, and those would be considered the horizontal ones, the ones we can expect. You know, my daughter's graduating, my son's playing in the band, those normative stressors, and I'm a little nervous about all those things, about the transition moving forward. So I'm nervous about those things, but I can expect them. But those horizontal stressors also include things that we may not anticipate. So an untimely death, right? Those are things that happen across the family life cycle, thinking from a developmental perspective. But I also want us to consider what we inherit, right? What these fathers of individuals with autism who happen to be Black, Latino, Asian, Native American, biracial, or have, several cultural identities, who acknowledge all of their cultural identities, the vertical stressors, and what we have learned and has been passed down to us. And so consider how some communities may engage in stigmatizing mental health. And to what extent have I learned that and been socialized to think, and have I inherited it? The most frequent example I use is, the 15th birthday of a female adolescent, right? So that's a vertical, it becomes, because it's a tradition, it might become a vertical stressor as a result of all the stress, anticipation, excitement, and the intersecting of all of those things taking place for a family. So we have these horizontal stressors that we've inherited, our secrets, our family desires, the myths about who we are, and then we have these horizontal stressors, the things that we can anticipate over time. Some of them are developmental nature, some of them are not and unanticipated. But then consider, if you look at this graphic, the system levels by which we engage with the vertical and horizontal stressors, right? So what is the social and political landscape across this country about autism and people of color? And then, as I'm thinking about the social and political landscape of minority fathers, racial ethnic minority fathers of individuals with autism, and what the nation says about it, what the news says about it, and then I have to engage with my local community, right? What are folks saying about this at work? What are folks saying about this when I go to the baseball field with my son or my daughter at an athletic event? What are folks saying about this in my place of worship? And then if we drill down just a little more, my extended family, right? So you begin to see the intersection between the vertical stressors and my extended family and what folks are saying about this particular issue and how I'm interpreting and making meaning about it. My nuclear family, the folks who are most close to me, who are closest to me. And then after all of that's said and done, I now have my own scripts and my own things that I'm thinking about as I make sense of this experience. So these fathers and how they respond to unexpected stressors, or stressors in general, but particularly those that are unexpected, certainly have an influence on how I make meaning of this. And so, as we move, now that I've hopefully shared with you some context about what fatherhood means, autism diagnosis rates, and how fathers might make meaning of those things, especially if we consider those to be stressors, horizontal stressors in particular, then you have this diagnosis of autism.
Dr. Hannon?
Yes.
Let's take a minute just to pause for a question. We did have one question that came through referring to one of your earlier slides. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
So the question that came in was, what do you think is associated with the rise or prevalence of autism in New Jersey?
That's a great question, and I don't know that I have a specific answer. I think on one side, there are people who believe, there are people who ascribe to the notion that some environmental influences that may be influencing how much autism is diagnosed in this state. So there's a community of folks who attribute the rise in autism diagnosis just generally, and possibly in New Jersey with vaccinations in particular, specifically rather. But then somebody might also say, and this is, I think, where I lean, not heavily, but this is where I lean, is that New Jersey has a pretty comprehensive assessment system, right? So our early intervention system, our pediatricians generally have their eyes open for symptoms that may reflect autism. And as soon as that happens, even in my own experience, when my son was 18 or 19 months and he didn't have very many words and not a whole lot of expressive language, when he should have had about 20 words, he probably had about 4. Our pediatrician said he needs to see a developmental pediatrician, and you need to reach out to early intervention. And so I think there are some checks and balances in New Jersey that exist that may not exist nationwide, which may contribute to the increased diagnosis rate. But there also may be some environmental conditions. So I think both of those are at play. But I'm not resolved about a specific answer, if that makes sense.
Okay, thank you. We have another question. It's a two-part question.
Sure.
The question is, to what degree are your comments similar or different vis-a-vis mothers of color? And then the second part is, are there differences across various racial or ethnic groups' experiences with children with autism spectrum disorder?
Awesome set of questions. And I don't want to speak out of turn, right? So one thing I've learned is not to say things, don't talk about things you don't know. So when it comes to mothers of color who have children with autism, I don't know their experiences except for the people with whom I engage. I think generally, because I'm gonna make some generalizable statements, so forgive me if they reach too wide. But I think women and females are generally socialized to be more emotionally expressive, not in a bad way, but really just identifying how they feel and being willing to share those things, whereas men are not. So even women of color might be in a better position to confront the stressors, the challenges, and the rewards of this experience because they say more, versus men and men of color who have been socialized to not say as much. Shelley, give me the second part of that question.
The second part of the question was, are there differences across various racial or ethnic groups' experiences with children with ASD?
Here's what I'll say. I collected some data from a very small pilot group of urban fathers in New York City, and they happen to identify as Caribbean, African American, Latino. The Latino gentleman was Dominican. The Caribbean gentleman, I think, was Jamaican or Haitian. I can't remember off the top of my head. But having these men from different minority groups talk generally about trust. Right? Their concerns were about, can I trust the service provider to give me the most useful information to support my children's well-being, and not trusting that I'm going to get, as a person of color, as a man of color, I'm going to get the same same recommendations as a white client or a white consumer coming in here with his or her family. And so I think some of those, and again, I say it very tentatively, that may be generalizable to across racial or ethnic groups, but I don't want to speak with an absolute certainty because I don't know that.
Okay. Thank you.
And so, Shelley, if it's okay, I'm going to continue to move on.
Yeah, fine.
So when we think about just generally speaking, and fathers and unexpected stressors, kind of extending this conversation and these comments, what we know generally, you know this by way of your own experiences versus what any research tells us, but we have some research to back up that says, these horizontal stressors can affect dads in some specific ways that include mourning or grief and bereavement experience, being stigmatized because of my children's differences, and the relationship with my partner or spouse when it comes to making sense of this experience and what it means for us as a team or in our partnership. So those are some of the more general ways that fathers experience distress. But I want us to consider how males are socialized, and I alluded to this earlier in the presentation. But men, and by extension dads, are socialized to use scripts. And I want us to consider this. The strong and silent script that men sometimes, or in many cases, are socialized to learn, the strong and silent script is literally the restricted emotionality, right? So I don't have any emotions. Somebody might say, Mike, how do you feel? Well, I don't have a bank of feeling words because I don't feel. And so the strong and silent type speaks to a restricted emotionality. The tough guy is really just my discomfort with how I'm feeling, even though I'm not able to communicate it, is usurped by aggression. Right, so I'm feeling uncomfortable, and you may see this play out with young boys or even young girls who may not know how to identify and communicate their feelings in a constructive way, and it's demonstrated by aggressive behavior, aggressive attitudes, and/or a fearlessness and an invulnerability that they may say that they have or demonstrate by way of their behavior. There's give them hell, again, an extension of this using aggression to undermine or repress those feelings. And then the Playboy script, right? So this hypersexual behavior. How many partners can I have? How many women or men can I sleep with? And so these are the scripts that males learn over the course of their lives, in some respects, to deal with how we're socialized. I'm sorry about that. And then let's think about how we're socialized with respect to health-seeking behavior. Across the board, globally, we can say that men are not encouraged to engage in help-seeking behavior. So if you see these studies that I'm referencing, these are men in the UK about their preventative health and having to work through their own issues of just going to the doctor. Older Black American men in doctor visits feeling like they're talked to and infanticized as they visit doctors, and so which does not encourage them to seek further help. Men in Zimbabwe and their sexual health, and thinking like even in the midst of the rate of sexually transmitted infections on the continent of Africa, and in particular countries, that even in the midst of those conditions, men are generally still demonized and called feminine for seeking help. Asian Pacific Islander men and their reticence or their hesitation in seeking mental health services, and Latino immigrant men experiencing real symptoms of depression, mood disorder, I'm not motivated, I'm losing weight, I'm not engaging in the activities. Those are all symptoms of depression, and still not seeking help from mental health service providers, right? So this is a cross-cultural phenomenon when we think about how men are socialized when they confront a particular stressor. So as we kind of wind down some of these slides, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about how all of these things collide. So if you look at this slide, it's really just an attempt to highlight what many of us call intersectionality. The intersection of all of my roles as a dad, as a person of color, as a man of color, my age, my gender, my cultural traditions, and all those intersect at some point in time as I navigate my life experience. So for fathers of color, intersectionality acknowledges that oppression can take place. I can feel stigmatized. I can be denied opportunity. Those can be direct and explicit forms of oppression, but they could also be very implicit. But it can take place based on the intersection of my identities because we assume roles that intersect. I'm a father, I'm a son, I'm an employee, I'm a community member, I'm a church member. All those intersect, and in some ways, based on the intersection, somebody may, or some system may engage in oppressive behavior toward or against me. So when we think about how we engage fathers, we have to think about demographics, identity, and the relationships with opportunities and outcomes related to race, socioeconomic status, ability status, sexual orientation, gender expression. And so even some of the limitations of my own research, I've had the opportunity to engage with heterosexual men, with straight men, most of whom are either married or in committed relationships to the biological mothers of their children with autism. What might research say if I or you or your research and clinical colleagues will begin to investigate the experiences of gay men or poor men, and think about how the answers, the questions and the answers may be different based on some of those intersecting variables. I hope that makes sense. In some of my own research, I'll share what the men of color I've been able to engage with and have contributed to my research, what they've identified as the rewards and the challenges. So thinking about men of color, I've probably interviewed over 20 men in the last 2 years, most of whom have been men of color, come from racial or ethnic minority backgrounds. And some of them, there seems to be a pretty consistent theme that I'm interpreting, and they validated it, that the most rewarding part of their fathering experiences as fathering individuals with autism is to see their kids successful, right? So for the service providers who were on this webinar, when we think about men who actually seek help and what we may do and how we might frame our work, when we can help them identify when and how and what spaces their children are successful, their sons or daughters are successful, that might be useful. So the men that I've interviewed, I've interpreted two types of success. The intrapersonal success, my child developing self-efficacy, his or her confidence in being able to carry out a task, right? Developing a solid communication system between my child and me, because my child may not have expressive language. And so we got to come up with a way to communicate. And so those things. And spiritual development. I interviewed a father of an individual with autism who son did not have expressive language, meaning he did not have words that he can communicate, or very, very, very limited words. But his son, the son with autism, was savvy and sophisticated enough to appreciate the traditions in the household. Now, this was a Christian household, and so every time that this son saw his father walk in from work and interpreted the father being stressed, he would go to the father, put his hands on his head, and pray for him in the same way that he saw that take place in church services and in the house. And so the father, moved to tears, talked about his son's own spiritual development. And even though they didn't have a communication system that included verbal language, that they had another communication system that provided ample evidence that this young man was engaged in his own spiritual development, and that was rewarding from him. And then the interpersonal success the fathers talk about, the relationship building. And when we acknowledge the challenges that people with autism confront with respect to relationship building and socializing, fathers seeing their children engage in the community in effective ways and constructive ways was really rewarding. And seeing the community respond to them in empathic ways really provided them a sense of reward and success. When we talk about the challenges, these were varied, and I think this is just as interesting, if not more interesting, than the rewards is, for those of you who are researchers, there was not data saturation. I didn't find one consistent answer across these interviews, but you see the range of challenges, the most significant challenges that these fathers reported in being a father of an individual with autism. Challenges related to my own unpreparedness to meet my child's needs. And communicate with my son, the need to feel that the need to protect my son from people who might misunderstand his behavior, right? Feeling isolated. I'm thinking about my child's developmental trajectory and what he will or will not be able to do moving forward. Coordinating care, which can be very overwhelming and intimidating. And then, when symptoms are really, really severe, it can be quite a challenge. And so those are some of the things that I found in my own research. When we think about how we might engage fathers, and this is really beginning to close down the presentation to open it up for more questions. If any of you grew up in somewhere between the 1980s and 1990s, I grew up in the 80s. I was born in 1975, and as hip hop became more global, you may remember a company called FUBU. And that acronym stood for Us, By Us. And it was basically initiated by a group of young men from Jamaica, Queens, New York, because they didn't see themselves represented in the fashion industry. And I'm going to borrow, with all due respect, that idea that when we think about recommendations and supporting fathers of individuals with autism, we have to consider what these fathers have shared with me, what I found both experientially and data-driven, and that these fathers are talking about for dads, by dads. So consider these points, right? So fathers need an orientation. In my dissertation research and my ongoing research right now, fathers were overwhelmed at the news of their children's diagnosis with autism, which makes total sense. Didn't anticipate it. You may have seen symptoms, but maybe not wanting to acknowledge it, maybe attributing the symptoms to a later developmental trajectory than a female child that was in the house. But none of these fathers, based on the way they were informed about their children's diagnosis, very negative prognosis about their children. Your child will never do X. Your child will always have a tough time doing Z. That literally turned them off. And they had to find their own ways to get oriented to this diagnosis. So when we think about orienting fathers, my suggestion, based on my own research, is what are the most simple and easiest ways to communicate this issue for my child, this difference in my child, and how to support my child in confronting it and developing a set of skills. What does it mean in the most simple of terms? All of the fathers of my dissertation and the fathers that I've interviewed beyond my dissertation all typically went to the biological mothers of their children, those who were married and those who were not married, for an interpretation, the distilled version of all of the medical language that was provided them in the formal diagnoses. Right? So thinking about how we can orient fathers in the simplest of ways so that they better understand how to support their children. And as I share these with you, one might argue that these might be linear in presentation. and hopefully that'll make sense if it doesn't make sense now. Research suggests, and based on what you know about the men in your life who are fathers, particularly the men of color, fathers prefer coaching over counseling. Now, consider this. Seeking help from someone who has more experience, right? If you consider the athletic field, you've likely seen men and boys get yelled at, get berated, and all kinds of behavior that they wouldn't tolerate in any other setting, but they'll accept it from a coach or somebody that they perceive to be a coach, because the coach represents somebody with a similar experience, but with more and deeper experience. So this person has been through this experience already and has something to share with me, and I trust that this person has my best interest at heart and in mind. And so instead of seeking somebody who's been trained to help, which is legitimate in and of itself, I'd rather seek help from someone who has more experience, deeper experience, who can coach me through this experience and this diagnosis. Coaching versus counseling, right? So I need an orientation. Who's going to give me that orientation? Sometimes the mothers have, other times somebody who I regard as a coach may be helpful as well. This third, and this is really gendered, so I apologize for that, but this is what some research recommends. As fathers are orienting themselves to their children's diagnosis and how their children are different from other kids in the neighborhood, other kids in school, and other kids in the community, consider in that helping to provide simple physical tasks to help them understand, right? So when we think about activities that require physical activities, obstacles, thinking through particular issues, that helps foster a sense of accomplishment. And this research in particular that I'm highlighting, the Flip It in Christ research, was for fathers of individuals with autism. And that was finding ways that they can engage with their sons and daughters in rough and tumble and physical play, so that it was a way that they could connect. The other article that it's referenced, the Scheinfeld and others, was a retreat that these men took, the sample of men took, that was an adventure-based outdoor experience setting in which they were doing rock climbing, zip lining, and all kinds of physical activities as they engaged around the common issue, the common shared experience of having an individual with autism. And then peer-to-peer feedback, which is really an extension of the coaching versus counseling. If I can't find a coach, if I can't find someone who has had more and deeper experience with this phenomenon, then it certainly helps me to find somebody who's going through it right now with me. And so these things, with respect to help-seeking behavior, for men in many ways, this is more respectable than seeking help from a service provider, a formal service provider. And so these are the things that I would encourage us to think about, and that personally I'm asking follow-up questions with men I get to interview about what are the best forms of support for you. The overwhelming evidence is, and the data that I have, are for dads, by dads. The last thing I'll say is that I'm trying this even now in my home community here in South Jersey. My nonprofit organization hosts a Dad's Connection group, and that's been very intentional about not saying it's a counseling group or a support group, but I have a Dad's Connection group that meets on a monthly basis of children with a range of special needs. And we don't, the criteria is that you just have to identify being a fathering relationship. It's not, there's no racial or ethnic criteria related to it. And it's been a bit of a challenge, but the fathers who do come out appreciate connecting with each other and asking each other questions versus helping a helper, a professional helper, or a service provider. So these are the things that I would suggest and recommend when we think about how we might engage racial or ethnic minority fathers of individuals with autism.
Thank you, Dr. Hannes.
Yep.
We have a few questions before we wrap up the webinar. We have a few questions if you have another minute to go through some of these. The first question, it's a multi-point question. It says, please describe the qualitative methods and analyses you use to study the lived experience of these fathers.
Okay.
The second part says, how do you establish the transferability of your findings? And then the third part is, what are some of the important future research questions that you feel need to be further explored? So we could break it up a little bit. Let's start with the first part of that.
Sure.
Please describe the qualitative methods and analyses you use to study the lived experience of these fathers.
Love that question. Thank you for asking, for whoever asked it, as all the questions that are coming in. I appreciate them all. Qualitative method. My qualitative method is narrative inquiry. It's phenomenological in nature, in that it seeks to describe a particular lived experience, and the way that I've collected data were by interviews, right? So interview data were my sole source of data, and what narrative inquiry allows, because it aligns well with phenomenology, is that it takes those lived experiences and then communicates them by way of the men's narratives. So recognizing that every story, well, let me back up. What narrative inquiry assumes is that we communicate our experiences, those lived experiences, by way of narratives, right? We never just tell people random things. We connect them by way of a story. Hey, I went to the store the other day. We saw Avery's friend, and we developed a play date. And then when we had the play date, it turned pretty ugly because somebody made a really disparaging remark about kids with disabilities. So we communicate by story. And what narrative inquiry does is literally contextualizes the story by asking questions about the lived experience. Every story has a setting, a plot, and a resolution. So consider how deep we can better understand this experience when we communicate it by stories. And so the plot is individuals, minority fathers of individuals with autism. The setting is how and way they navigate their experience. And hopefully the resolution over time is that they feel better about themselves and better about their children. So when we think about methodology and methodological tradition, phenomenology grounds my work, and I use narrative inquiry to communicate findings.
The second part of the question was, how do you establish the transferability of your findings?
Yeah, that's a great question too, and I appreciate it. The transferability or generalizability of these findings is tough because I'm interviewing smaller samples. And so instead of intending to generalize the findings, I'm intending to provide a system and a protocol where the same methods, data collection, interpretation, analysis, can be used with other groups. So there's two ways we might do it. I might continue to interview and engage with men from different ethnic groups and see how much we can compare and contrast the findings. That may speak to some of its transferability or generalizability, but my intent is not to generalize. My intent is to deepen, right? When I think about generalizability, I think about going wide and broad, and there's certainly value to that when we think about interventions for populations. But just as valuable is our deep and rich understanding of the experience. And if those experiences are similar across populations, then at that point in time we begin. But because this is exploratory in nature, I would argue that it's first more important, and that's arguable, but to me it's more important to have a deep and rich understanding of the experience and then ask if the same experiences exist for other populations. Does that make sense?
Thank you. We have a couple more.
Sure.
What are some of the important future research questions that you feel need to be further explored?
Absolutely. Right now, I'm doing I'm using another qualitative research tradition called grounded theory, and so one specific question I'm about to literally start asking right now with a group of men from across the country is, how were you oriented to autism? And so I'm curious if what I found with these African American and other fathers of color about how they were oriented to their children's diagnosis, if that is actually generalizable to a wider demographic, a more diverse demographic. And so I have about 40 men I'm interviewing who have a range of racial ethnic backgrounds, and asking them how they're oriented, because that orientation influences the father's perspective. And so that's one particular question. Another question is, what might fathers, how do fathers describe their experiences with schools? Because our children, no matter how wide their symptoms are, they all have educational experiences. And so the school is a community resource that we cannot overlook. And so one of my personal questions is better understanding and finding out how fathers describe their relationships with schools so that schools might better engage fathers in their children's educational experience. So those are two that that stand out to me right away.
Okay. We have another question. Could you tell us some more about your son and his various strengths and assets?
Oh, I'd love to. Thank you for asking that. My son is 11 years old, and he would be considered high functioning, right? So Avery, his name is Avery, and Avery has expressive language. He has receptive language. If you're familiar with New Jersey and New Jersey school and school law, Avery is in an inclusion classroom that is required to have a regular education teacher and a special education teacher to meet the needs of all students, but with a particular emphasis for students who have diagnoses and individualized education plans. Avery has an incredible memory and loves to express himself. And so I call him an artsy kid because he loves to sing, dance, and act. And because he has expressive language, we allow him to do that. We found a great value in him participating in martial arts over the years to help with his executive functioning because that's one of his challenge areas. And certainly he is still a little developmentally behind his peers. And so him navigating social experiences is tough for him. For students who may be making fun of him in implicit ways, that's a challenge. But his strengths are his incredible memory, his expressive language, and the extent he wants to connect with other people. Like that typical symptom of autism does not affect Avery in ways that it affects other individuals with autism.
Thank you. And we have one more question. I know you mentioned your organization that you co-founded with your wife, the Greater Expectations Teach-In and Advocacy Center for Childhood Disabilities, and some of the supports that you provide there. And this question is related to that.
Sure.
In your research, did you find anything? Is there anything that you found in terms of father orientation or support groups in New Jersey or in surrounding areas for fathers with children on the autism spectrum?
That's a great question as well. And here's what I'll say to that. New Jersey has a number of awesome grassroots organizations, many of whom, for those of you on the call, on the webinar, who may not be familiar with the network, the New Jersey Statewide Network on Cultural Competence, and many of those organizations are connected with the network. But there are several grassroots organizations that kind of, in my estimation, and very respectfully, kind of operate in isolation. And I may be guilty of the same thing with respect to reaching out to fathers. And so there are great groups, advocacy groups, father support groups that kind of operate in pockets across the state. And for anybody who's familiar with New Jersey, you know how geographically diverse our state is. So there's a bunch of metropolitan areas, there's a bunch of rural areas, and a whole lot of suburban areas. And so when I think about my organization's outreach in my local community, it's just that. It's me and my organization, our team, in our little corner of the world, trying to do what we can for the families who live, work, and serve here. But there are great organizations across the state, and many of whom can be connected. You can be connected to by engaging with the network, engaging with large-scale organizations like Autism New Jersey, and the Statewide Parent Advocacy Network, SPAN. Those are three awesome organizations that can get you pointed to other groups that may be doing similar work in scope.
Thank you so much. We want to take this time now to let everyone know that we appreciate your attendance for this webinar on behalf of the New Jersey Statewide Network for Cultural Competence. If you'd like more information on the Statewide Network, you can go to our website at www.nj.gov/NJSNCC, and you could find more information. The webinar will be archived and made available on the NJSNCC website. Please don't forget to complete your survey, which will appear at the end on your screen at the end of this webinar. And also, I just wanted to take a minute to let you know that the NJSNCC will have an upcoming conference on November 9th. The conference is titled Trauma-Informed Care and Services for Diverse Populations, Best and Promising Practices, and it's going to be held right here in New Brunswick. If you'd like more information, you could sign up for our listserv. You could also view our Facebook page, NJSNCC, and you could go to the website if you'd like more information. Dr. Hannon, thank you for posting your information. If anyone is interested in getting in touch with Dr. Hannon, if you have any additional questions or would like to reach out to him as a resource, especially to connect with him on his newly founded organization, please feel free to do so. Thank you again, Dr. Hannon, for your presentation. It was very informative. We appreciate your time. Thank you, everyone.